Lucas Brady had always been a man of precision. Every moment of his life was orchestrated down to the last second. From the time he woke up to the time he fell asleep, his days were calculated, each task falling neatly into the next like the gears of a finely tuned machine. He was the CEO of a billion-dollar tech company, a man whose name had become synonymous with success. He didn't just lead, he dominated. Every deal he closed, every negotiation he led, elevated him further into the stratosphere of the elite. That morning was no different. Lucas's driver, Martin, navigated through the city's busy streets, the car moving with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Lucas sat in the back, his suit impeccable, a dark navy fabric that contrasted sharply against the glossy black of the car. His dark brown curls were perfectly combed, his green eyes sharp and focused, scanning through emails and documents on his tablet with a sense of urgency. He was headed to a meeting that would change everything. The potential merger he was about to close wasn't just another deal. It was the deal. The one that would double the reach of his company, propel him into a new echelon of power, and make his name even more unassailable in the business world. The figures and numbers running across his screen were a language he spoke fluently, and the vision of success was already crystal clear in his mind. Lucas's world moved at the speed of light. Deadlines, meetings, and conference calls were his constant companions. He didn't have time for distractions, and he certainly didn't have time for emotional indulgence. Emotions were a luxury he didn't believe in. His empire was built on logic, hard work, and most importantly, control. Everything and everyone around him played a role in the grand equation of success, and nothing, no matter how urgent, was going to get in the way of his next step. As the car sped down the road, Lucas felt the familiar rush of anticipation in his chest. He was closing in on his destination. Just a few more minutes, and he'd be in the meeting room, commanding the attention of executives, negotiating terms, and signing the deal that would solidify his future. The stakes were high, but Lucas wasn't fazed. He thrived under pressure. The more demanding the situation, the more his mind sharpened. Yet, in the midst of this calculated chaos, something caught his eye. A small figure sitting alone on a bench, a child in the middle of a busy park. It wasn't the sight of a child that gave him pause. It was the loneliness that radiated from the boy. He was hunched over, his small shoulders trembling in what looked like silent sobs. The boy was no more than 7 or 8, dressed in clothes that seemed slightly out of place for the middle of the city. His clothes weren't ragged, but they were wrinkled, as if he had been sitting there for far too long. For a moment, Lucas couldn't understand why he was paying attention. He was on his way to a crucial meeting, his mind racing with numbers and strategies. Why was he even noticing this boy? He told himself it wasn't his problem. Someone would take care of him. There were systems in place, social workers, security guards, concerned citizens. Someone would surely see the child and help him. Yet, as his car passed by the park, Lucas's gaze lingered. The boy didn't look like he was simply waiting for someone to pick him up. There was a depth to the loneliness in his posture, a sense of abandonment that seemed too real to ignore. His heart twisted, a sharp, unfamiliar feeling gnawing at him. He tried to push it aside, but the image of the boy sitting there, so small and alone, seemed to pierce through the wall of control he had built around himself. Something felt wrong. His green eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The boy was still sitting there, his face buried in his hands now, his small body shaking with quiet sobs. Lucas could feel the pull in his chest, the inexplicable urge to do something, to help. He couldn't explain it. He wasn't a man who responded to emotions, yet there was something about this child, something that unsettled him deeply, that wouldn't let him move on. "Martin," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension in the car. The driver glanced at him through the mirror. "Sir." "Slow down," Lucas ordered, his voice sharper than he intended. Martin didn't question him, slowing the car in response, though his eyes flicked nervously to the clock. "But sir, we're already running behind." "The merger." "I said slow down," Lucas repeated, his tone firm. The world outside the car seemed to blur as Lucas's thoughts raced. The meeting. The merger. The deal that could make his company one of the largest in the world. And yet, here he was, staring at a child sitting alone in a park, his heart tightening with every passing second. It didn't make sense. None of it did. As they passed the park, Lucas couldn't help but look over his shoulder. The boy's face was now visible through the rearview mirror, his features streaked with tears, his eyes hollow with a sadness that seemed too old for someone so young. The boy looked up just as Lucas turned his head, and their eyes met. For a moment, Lucas felt as if the world had stopped. The child's eyes were bright green. They were the exact shade of green that Lucas sought every day in the mirror. They were his eyes. The eyes of someone who had always been driven, always been focused on success, on the next step, on the next deal. But those eyes, those sad, hollow eyes, stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years. A deep, primal connection. Without thinking, Lucas's voice cut through the silence of the car. "Stop the car." Martin's eyes widened in confusion. "But sir, we're all ready." "Stop the car." "Now," Lucas repeated, his voice sharp and commanding. The car pulled to the curb with a slight jolt, the engine humming as it came to a complete stop. Lucas didn't wait for Martin to open the door. He stepped out quickly, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The world around him seemed distant now, the noise of the city fading into a dull hum as he walked toward the park. His mind clouded with a feeling he couldn't quite explain. The boy was still there, sitting on the bench, staring down at his hands. His stuffed animal, a worn-out dog, was clutched tightly in his arms. Lucas approached slowly, his steps hesitant. The boy didn't notice him at first, his face buried in his lap. "Hey," Lucas said softly, crouching down in front of him. The boy looked up in surprise, his tear-streaked face revealing a look of both fear and hope. "Are you okay?" Lucas asked, his voice quieter now, as if the weight of the moment had shifted. The boy wiped his face with the back of his hand, his lips trembling as he looked up at Lucas. She said she'd be right back," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. "She went into the store, but she never came out." Lucas felt something in his chest tighten. This wasn't just a random encounter. Something about the boy's words, his sadness, felt too real. "Where's your mom?" Lucas asked gently, kneeling down beside him. The boy shook his head slowly. "I don't know. She said she'd be back soon. But she's not here." Lucas glanced around the park, his heart racing. There were a few people milling about, but no one seemed to be paying attention to the child. No one seemed to notice the small boy sitting there, abandoned and alone. Something inside Lucas stirred. His empire, his plans, everything he had worked for, suddenly seemed distant. None of it mattered in that moment. This child needed help, and for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt the overwhelming urge to step in. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't sure what had driven him to make this decision. But he knew, in that instant, that he couldn't leave without doing something. "Don't worry," Lucas said softly, his voice steady now. "I'll help you." And just like that, Lucas Brady, the man who had built his empire by staying emotionally detached, felt something shift deep within him, something that he hadn't felt in years. Compassion, a sense of responsibility. He wasn't sure where this moment would lead, but he knew that he couldn't turn away. Not now. Not when this boy needed him most. And in that moment, Lucas Brady's life began to change. Lucas stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on the boy, trying to process what was happening. The world seemed to move in slow motion, as though everything had paused around them, leaving only the two of them standing in the midst of an overwhelming silence. The noise of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the bustling people walking by, all faded away. There was only the boy and the raw vulnerability that radiated from him. He had seen pain before, of course. He had experienced the kind of stress and exhaustion that only comes with high-stakes business decisions, the kind of pressure that made every day feel like a fight to the finish. He had witnessed personal tragedies and had heard about others in his circle experiencing loss or hardship. But this was different. The boy in front of him wasn't merely an observer of pain. He was the living embodiment of it. The boy's eyes were full of a sadness so deep, it made Lucas's heart ache in a way he wasn't accustomed to. And the way he clutched that worn-out stuffed dog, his only companion in the face of abandonment, struck something inside Lucas, a feeling of helplessness he'd never allowed himself to experience. Lucas could feel the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders, as though the moment had become something much larger than he was. The future of his company, the merger that could change everything, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the child in front of him. "I'll help you," Lucas repeated softly, though the words felt hollow in the face of what he was about to do. He didn't know how or what he could possibly offer, but he couldn't walk away. The boy's face, tear-streaked and full of quiet desperation, haunted him. The child looked up at him, his bright green eyes now filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. He wiped his face again, his small hands trembling, not sure whether to trust the stranger standing before him. After a long silence, the boy spoke again, his voice barely audible. I don't know where she went. She promised she'd come back." Lucas crouched down, his knees bending stiffly as he lowered himself to the boy's level. There was something disarming about the child's words, something that felt like a cry for help, a simple plea for understanding. Lucas had always been the type of person to act decisively, to handle situations with efficiency and precision. But this was different. There was no business strategy, no negotiation, no clear answer in front of him. There was only a scared child in need of a protector, and Lucas had to figure out how to fill that role. "Do you remember where she went?" Lucas asked gently. His mind was spinning with options, but none of them felt like they were enough. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The boy nodded slowly, his face still pale and streaked with tears. "She went into the store over there," he said, his voice shaky. "She told me to wait here and went inside to buy something. I think it was for me, but she didn't come back." Lucas stood up and turned to look at the small convenience store the boy had pointed to. It was a modest building with a few people walking in and out. The bright fluorescent lights inside flickered through the windows, casting a sterile glow onto the sidewalk. It seemed like such a mundane place, and yet it was the very heart of this child's distress. Lucas's mind raced. If the boy's mother had simply gone inside for a few minutes, then where was she now? And why hadn't she returned? He glanced back at the boy, whose tear-filled eyes were now fixed on him, waiting for a response. The child was clinging to his stuffed dog, as if it were his only lifeline, and in some ways, Lucas realized, it probably was. "Stay here for a moment," Lucas said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He wasn't sure what he would find when he entered that store, but he knew he had to go in. The boy had already been alone for too long, and Lucas couldn't bear to leave him there any longer. As he walked toward the store, his thoughts tumbled over each other. What had happened to the boy's mother? Had she simply abandoned him, or was something more serious at play? He reached for his phone, wondering if he should call the authorities, but he hesitated. His mind, though accustomed to moving quickly in business, was struggling to process the emotions of the moment. He wasn't used to feeling uncertain, but everything about this situation felt like uncharted territory. The door of the store swung open with a soft chime as Lucas entered, the cool air inside a stark contrast to the warmth of the street outside. The shelves were lined with everyday goods, and a few customers moved leisurely through the aisles. Behind the counter stood an older woman with graying hair, wearing a faded apron. She looked up from a register as Lucas approached. "I'm sorry to bother you," Lucas began, trying to sound polite and professional despite the unease settling in his chest. "I'm looking for a little boy's mother. He's been waiting outside, and she hasn't come back yet. Do you know if she's still here?" The woman raised an eyebrow, her eyes scanning Lucas with some suspicion. "What boy?" she asked, glancing around the store. Lucas stepped aside slightly to let her see the empty space by the door. "He's sitting on a bench outside. He's about 7, with brown hair and green eyes." The woman's expression softened, and she looked down at the counter as if trying to recall something. "I didn't see any child outside earlier. It's been a quiet morning." Lucas's stomach churned. This wasn't adding up. The boy had been so certain that his mother had gone into the store, and yet no one seemed to have seen her. He took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "Are you sure? Could someone have seen her leave?" Lucas pressed, feeling the urgency rise in his voice. The woman hesitated for a moment, glancing around the store once more. "I'm sorry. I don't know. But if you're concerned, you might want to call the police. Maybe she had an emergency or something." Lucas's frustration grew. The words "call the police" felt like a lifeline, but it also felt like giving up. It meant he was handing the situation over to someone else, something he rarely did. He didn't want to just hand the boy over to a system that would treat him like another statistic. Without another word, Lucas stepped back out of the store and onto the sidewalk, where the boy was still sitting, clutching his stuffed dog as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. "Hey," Lucas said softly as he approached. "I'm going to help you find your mom, but I think we might need some help with this." The boy's face lit up slightly, though his eyes still carried that heavy sadness. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lucas knelt down beside him, determined to reassure him. "We're going to make sure you're safe. You're not alone." The boy nodded, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket. Lucas looked around, considering his options. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder of the meeting he was supposed to be attending, but it felt as though the entire world had faded into the background. In that moment, nothing else mattered. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," Lucas said firmly, standing up and glancing down at the boy with newfound resolve. He wasn't sure how this story would end, but one thing was certain: it was no longer about the merger, or the meeting, or the life he had carefully built. It was about something much bigger, something he had never expected to find, but had now stumbled into: a moment of vulnerability, and a chance to do something truly meaningful. And with that, Lucas Brady's journey into the unknown began, one step at a time. The moment Lucas knelt beside the boy, his heart weighed down by a sense of duty he had never experienced before. He knew he was in uncharted waters. Everything that had once defined him, the structure of his life, his relentless pursuit of success, seemed distant now, out of reach, and suddenly unimportant. The child, with his tear-streaked face and pleading eyes, had become the center of Lucas's world, in a way he could neither explain nor ignore. "Don't worry," Lucas reassured the boy, trying to offer comfort through words that felt too small for the magnitude of the situation. "We'll figure this out together." The boy, who had barely spoken since Lucas first approached him, managed a small, uncertain nod, his trembling hands clutching the stuffed dog even tighter. There was a fragility to the boy's small body, a vulnerability that seemed to speak volumes about the fear he had been carrying. Fear of abandonment, of being alone, of not knowing who to turn to. And in that moment, Lucas realized something he had never truly understood before. No matter how much wealth or success one had, it was hollow in comparison to the raw need for human connection, for kindness in the face of despair. Lucas stood up, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him. The meeting, the deal that could change everything for his company, for his future, was still an hour away. But that hour now seemed irrelevant, distant in the face of the real world unfolding before him. He had spent his entire life fighting for control, for power, for a place in the world that was defined by material success. But here, in front of him, was something he couldn't control, something beyond his expertise. A little boy who had been left alone on a bench, waiting for a mother who never returned. "I'm going to help you find your mom," Lucas said, more to himself than to the boy. It was a promise, one he wasn't sure he could keep, but one that felt necessary in that moment. He didn't know where to start or what steps to take, but he knew he couldn't let this child slip through the cracks, as so many children often did in the world Lucas had come from. He had the power, the resources. Why couldn't he use them for something more meaningful than another deal? Lucas looked around, scanning the area for any signs of the boy's mother. The small businesses around the park were bustling with activity, but no one seemed to be paying attention to the boy. The crowd was indifferent, as it often was in a city that moved too fast for most to notice the details, the quiet tragedies that unfolded on the edges of daily life. Lucas felt the sting of that indifference deeply. For all his wealth, his status, his reputation, he had never been someone who truly noticed, not in the way he needed to now. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, a stark reminder of the responsibilities he was shirking. But he silenced it without a second thought. His assistant's reminder, the agenda, the financial projections, all of it could wait. The world could wait. For now, all that mattered was finding this boy's mother, giving him the assurance that he wasn't alone, that he wasn't forgotten. "How long have you been waiting here?" Lucas asked, kneeling down once more beside the boy, who was now staring blankly at the ground. He seemed lost, as if the weight of his emotions had become too much to bear. "I don't know," the boy whispered, his voice small and fragile. "A long time. She told me to wait, but she never came back." Lucas felt a tightening in his chest. A long time. He couldn't imagine how long it must have felt for the boy, sitting there alone, hoping that his mother would return. How many minutes had ticked by without any sense of reassurance? How many moments had passed with no one to offer him comfort, no one to tell him it would be okay? The loneliness in the boy's voice echoed in Lucas's mind long after the words had been spoken. "What's your name?" Lucas asked softly, trying to shift the focus from the overwhelming uncertainty that loomed over them. If the boy could trust him, even just a little, maybe that would be enough to keep him from falling deeper into despair. "Ben," the boy replied, his voice barely audible. "Ben Harris." "All right, Ben," Lucas said, trying to inject some calm into the situation, though his insides were anything but calm. "We're going to figure this out. First, we'll see if anyone around here has seen your mom, okay?" Ben nodded, though his expression remained somber. Lucas straightened up and scanned the area, his mind working quickly. There were a few pedestrians walking along the sidewalks, some of them looking in his direction, but no one seemed particularly concerned with the boy on the bench. The indifference of the city was something Lucas had long grown accustomed to, but now it felt like a cold slap in the face. "I'm going to talk to a few people," Lucas said, more to himself than to Ben. "Stay here, all right? I won't be long." Lucas walked away from the bench, his shoes clicking on the pavement as he approached the first person he could find. A middle-aged man who was walking a dog. "Excuse me," Lucas began, his voice firm but polite. "Have you seen a woman with a young boy around here? He's about 7 or 8, brown hair, green eyes. The boy's waiting for her, but she hasn't returned." The man shook his head, looking at Lucas with mild confusion. "Sorry, haven't seen anyone like that," he replied. "But maybe try asking the store owners. They might know more." Lucas nodded, his frustration building. He thanked the man and moved on to the next person, then the next, asking anyone he could find. But each response was the same. No one had seen a woman matching the description, and no one seemed to know anything. It was as if Ben's mother had simply vanished into thin air. Lucas's heart sank. What if something had happened to her? What if she had been taken, or worse, what if she had simply abandoned her son? The thought was unbearable. He couldn't allow himself to think that way. He had to remain focused, to find answers. But the more he asked, the more he felt a growing sense of helplessness. Finally, Lucas returned to Ben, who was still sitting on the bench, his hands clutching the stuffed dog tightly in his lap. The boy's eyes lifted slowly as Lucas approached, the same look of uncertainty and fear in his gaze. "I talked to some people around here," Lucas said, crouching down in front of Ben again. "No one seems to know where your mom is. But I'm not going to give up, all right? We're going to find her." Ben looked at Lucas, his eyes wide, still filled with that silent, heartbreaking hope. "You mean it?" he asked softly, almost as if he couldn't believe that anyone would care enough to help him. Lucas nodded, a surge of determination filling him. "I promise you, Ben. We'll find her. I'm not going anywhere until we do." For the first time since Lucas had approached him, Ben offered a small, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Lucas of the stakes. This wasn't just about finding a missing person. It was about restoring the sense of safety and comfort that every child should have, the kind of protection Lucas had always taken for granted. It was about showing this boy, against all odds, that there were still people who cared enough to make a difference. With a renewed sense of purpose, Lucas knew that he wasn't going to stop until he found the answers. The journey ahead would be anything but easy, but it was a journey he was ready to take. The world had always been a place of calculated risks and precise movements for Lucas, but now, for the first time, he was navigating a world that couldn't be controlled, a world where compassion and human connection were the true measures of success. And no matter what it took, he would find Ben's mother, and he would make sure the boy was safe. Lucas Brady's life had been built on business, but now it was about something far more profound, a commitment to a child, to a moment that could change everything. And he wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Lucas stood silently beside Ben, taking in the weight of the promise he had just made. He could feel the gravity of the situation sinking deeper into him with every passing second. His mind kept racing through possibilities. Where could Ben's mother be? Why hadn't she returned? Was there something more to this than he realized? Every unanswered question gnawed at him, but the most pressing one was the simple fact that this boy was depending on him. And for once, in a world that had always been about power plays and negotiation tactics, Lucas had no clear answers. As he watched Ben's small form huddled tightly against the bench, his hands still clutching that beloved stuffed dog, a part of Lucas wondered just how long the boy had been alone. He had told Lucas that his mother had gone into the store, but what if that wasn't the truth? What if the mother had been gone for much longer, and Ben had been left to fend for himself on that cold bench? "Ben," Lucas said softly, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "Do you remember anything else? Anything at all? Did she say where she was going after the store?" The boy blinked, his eyes searching Lucas's face for reassurance. It was as though he was trying to piece together the memory, trying to grasp at something solid in the swirling confusion that had become his world. Finally, after a long pause, Ben shook his head, his lips trembling as he whispered, "She didn't say. She just told me to wait." Lucas could hear the quiet despair in the boy's voice, and it made his heart ache. To be that young, to be that vulnerable, and to be so utterly alone, it was unthinkable. He couldn't imagine leaving a child in that state, no matter the circumstances. But then, Lucas thought, the world wasn't always kind, and sometimes the harshest realities fell upon those who were least prepared to face them. The truth was, Ben didn't deserve this. No child did. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," Lucas repeated, his voice firmer this time, though his mind was still spinning. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the surrounding area again. The city felt colder now, more indifferent. He could feel the time slipping by, and with it, the pressure to find answers. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but Lucas ignored it once again. The world outside this small, painful moment seemed distant, unreachable. He had no choice but to trust his instincts, to lean into something he had rarely allowed himself to feel: empathy. He had spent years burying his emotions beneath layers of work and ambition, convinced that to feel was to be weak. But now, standing in front of a boy who had been abandoned, if only for a brief moment, it was impossible to ignore the depth of his own humanity. He wanted to fix this. He wanted to right the wrongs in the world that had led to this moment, even if it was just for this one child. "Let's go inside the store again," Lucas said, determination edging into his voice. "We'll see if anyone else knows anything." Ben hesitated for a moment, looking up at Lucas as if searching for a sign that everything would be okay. "Are you sure she's coming back?" the boy asked, his voice small and fragile, betraying the fear he had buried deep inside. Lucas felt a lump form in his throat at the question. The innocent, heartbreaking way Ben asked for reassurance hit Lucas harder than anything else had. He wanted to promise the boy that his mother would return, that everything would work out, but he didn't know that for sure. He had no idea what had happened to her, or if she would ever come back. "I don't know," Lucas admitted, his voice quieter than before. "But I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to help you." Lucas motioned for Ben to stay where he was as he walked back into the small store. He approached the counter again, this time speaking to the older woman who had greeted him earlier. "Excuse me," Lucas began, his voice more insistent now. "I need to know if anyone has seen a woman with a boy. She might have come in here earlier today. It's important." The woman, who had been busy restocking the shelf behind the counter, glanced up at Lucas, her expression skeptical at first, but something in his eyes seemed to make her pause. She set down the box of items she had been arranging and walked over to him. "Look, I told you earlier, I haven't seen anyone with a boy like that," she said, her tone apologetic but firm. "But if you're really worried, you might want to check with the security cameras. We've got them all over the place." Lucas's hope flickered for a moment. Of course, security cameras. Why hadn't he thought of that sooner? He nodded, grateful for the suggestion. "Could you pull up the footage from earlier today? Maybe it will show something." "Anything." The woman hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, I can do that. But you'll have to wait a bit. The footage isn't exactly easy to access." While the woman went to the back of the store to check the footage, Lucas returned to Ben, who had now gotten to his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of waiting any longer. "Ben," Lucas said gently, "I need you to stay inside for a little while longer. We might have something that can help us." Ben's face brightened slightly, though the wariness still lingered in his eyes. "Okay," he whispered. "But what if she's not coming back?" Lucas felt a pang in his chest. He didn't know how to answer that question. What if she wasn't coming back? What would happen to Ben then? Could Lucas really take on the responsibility of this boy's life? It was a thought he wasn't ready to entertain, but it hovered there, dark and unspoken. "We'll figure it out," Lucas said, more to reassure himself than Ben. "I promise you, we're going to figure this out." The woman returned shortly with a small digital monitor in hand, where she had pulled up the security footage. She stood beside Lucas, her finger hovering over the play button. The screen flickered to life, showing the view from a camera position near the entrance to the store. Lucas watched intently, his heart pounding in his chest. The footage was grainy, but it clearly showed a woman entering the store around the time Ben had said she did. Lucas studied the screen closely. The woman seemed hurried, her face a blur as she quickly made her way down the aisles. There was no sign of Ben, though, no indication that he had been left behind outside. And then, just as Lucas was about to turn away in frustration, something caught his eye. A shadow moving quickly in the background. The woman, her face more distinct now, was speaking to a man near the back of the store. They were talking animatedly, but what struck Lucas was the look of urgency in her expression. She seemed agitated, almost frantic. Lucas's gut twisted. Something didn't feel right. "What happened after this?" Lucas asked urgently, his voice low but filled with tension. The woman in the store frowned, her eyes scanning the screen. "She left in a hurry after that. I didn't see her again. She didn't even buy anything." Lucas's mind raced. This wasn't just an abandoned child. Something had happened here. This woman, Ben's mother, had left in a hurry. She hadn't bought anything. And then she vanished. "Can you zoom in on the man she was talking to?" Lucas asked, his voice tight with anxiety. The woman nodded, adjusting the footage to focus on the man in the background. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and there was something about his posture that made Lucas uneasy. "Who is he?" Lucas asked. The woman shook her head. "I've never seen him before, but there's something off about that conversation. It didn't seem normal." Lucas's heart skipped a beat. What was going on here? This was no longer just a missing person case. It was something much darker, and Lucas knew that Ben's world had just become far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The answers were out there, but Lucas wasn't sure he was prepared for what he might find. One thing was certain: this journey was only beginning, and it was going to take him to places he had never expected to go. Lucas's thoughts were a whirlpool of confusion and urgency as he studied the security footage. The unsettling scene played over in his mind. Again and again, the hurried woman, the unknown man in the background, and most disturbingly, the urgency in her eyes. Something was deeply wrong, but Lucas couldn't put his finger on it. This was no longer just a case of a child waiting for a mother. This was a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit, a mystery that seemed to be unraveling in ways Lucas had never anticipated. He had walked into this situation determined to help a child who had been abandoned for reasons beyond his understanding. Now, the more he uncovered, the more he realized how little he knew, how much was hidden beneath the surface. Ben, still sitting on the bench, was looking up at Lucas with expectant eyes. He didn't fully understand the weight of what was happening, but his trust in Lucas was palpable. The boy was innocent, but the situation was becoming anything but. Every minute that passed felt like it was tearing at the fabric of Lucas's resolve, and yet he couldn't bring himself to leave. "I'm going to figure this out, Ben," Lucas said softly, his voice firm, though it betrayed a deep sense of concern. The boy's gaze was unwavering, a silent plea for something more than just empty promises. It was a plea for safety, for certainty in a world that had just turned upside down. As he turned back to the store clerk, his mind began to work faster. "Do you know if the man she was talking to left the store with her?" Lucas asked, his eyes fixed on the screen. The woman had walked out quickly, and there had been no sign of Ben following her. But the man, he lingered in the shadows. The store clerk shook her head slowly. "I didn't see them leave together. After she left in a rush, I thought maybe she forgot something and would come back. But I haven't seen her since. He didn't seem like he was with her either." Lucas clenched his jaw, a deep sense of frustration bubbling within him. The pieces didn't add up. It was all too strange. A mother rushing out of the store, a child left alone. Then the strange man, lingering in the background as if he were watching them. This was no ordinary disappearance. This wasn't a case of a mother just forgetting her son. There was something far more sinister at play here. "Can you show me where the man went after he left the store?" Lucas asked, his mind already racing ahead. The woman at the counter hesitated for a moment, but nodded, walking over to the security monitor again. She rewound the footage, the screen now showing the man standing at the back of the store for a few moments, his figure dark and indistinct in the dim light. Then, without any noticeable change in his demeanor, he walked towards the front door, looking both ways before disappearing into the busy street outside. It was a small detail, but it made something inside Lucas snap. There had been nothing casual about his departure. The man had been watching the door, checking for something, perhaps for anyone to notice him. Maybe he had been watching the woman, making sure no one followed her. Lucas's instincts were on fire. This man was involved in something far bigger than a random encounter at a store. There was something darker, something malicious. It was as if this was all part of a plan, a deliberate action. "I need you to pull the footage from the street cameras," Lucas said urgently. "If this man left the store, someone must have seen where he went. We need to find him." The store clerk looked hesitant but nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I'll try, but I don't know how long it'll take." Lucas's mind was already moving 100 steps ahead. Every second felt like it was slipping away from him. As he watched the woman head to the back of the store, Lucas glanced over at Ben. The boy was sitting there quietly, his eyes now fixated on the ground. Lucas could see the weight of uncertainty in Ben's posture. He could feel the emotional burden pressing down on him too. It was like the boy was waiting for a savior, for someone to come through in a way that would take away all of his fears, all of his unanswered questions. And in that moment, Lucas realized something deep and unspoken. Ben wasn't just waiting for his mother to return. He was waiting for someone to believe in him, someone to make all the broken pieces fit together. Without a clear answer, Lucas walked over to Ben and sat beside him. The boy looked up at him, his eyes tired, yet still filled with a flicker of hope. "I'm not leaving," Lucas said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm going to find your mom. I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." Ben nodded slowly, his lip trembling as he whispered, "But what if she doesn't come back? What if she's gone forever?" Lucas swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the boy's words. What if she didn't come back? The question hung in the air between them like an unspoken truth. He didn't have an answer. How could he? How could anyone answer such a question when they didn't even know the full story? "I don't know, Ben," Lucas admitted, his voice soft and filled with empathy. "But I'll find out. And I'll make sure you're safe, no matter what happens." Ben looked at Lucas for a moment, as though trying to read the sincerity in his eyes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boy gave a small, tentative smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, but was enough to soften the rawness of the situation. Lucas stood up and looked around the park once more. The world was still moving around them, people walking, cars driving by, unaware of the pain unfolding on this small corner of the city. But for Lucas, everything else had faded away. It was just him and Ben now. And Lucas knew with a sudden clarity that he was going to uncover whatever had happened to this boy's mother, no matter how deep the truth went or how dangerous it might become. As the woman returned with more footage, Lucas felt a flicker of hope. The video had shown a moment of crucial detail, the man who had lingered, the way he moved through the store. If they could find him, they could uncover the mystery. And if they could uncover the mystery, maybe, just maybe, they could help Ben. The path ahead wasn't clear. There were too many unanswered questions, too many shadows that loomed in the corners of the story. But for the first time in his life, Lucas felt a real sense of purpose, a sense of responsibility that had nothing to do with profit margins or closing business deals. This was something deeper, something more human. Lucas looked down at Ben, who was now standing beside him, eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "We'll do this together," Lucas said, "you and me. And no matter what happens, I'll make sure you're safe." As the moment stretched on, and the security footage revealed more details, Lucas knew this was just the beginning. What they would find, where the search would lead, he couldn't say for sure. But there was one thing he knew without a doubt. This journey had changed him. No longer was he the man who raced through life, calculating every move, chasing after success. Now he was something else entirely, a protector, a guide, and above all, someone who was willing to fight for something much greater than himself. And as he looked into Ben's eyes, he could see the hope in the boy's heart that he wasn't alone. They were in this together, and Lucas wasn't going to let go until they found the truth. The morning sun had long disappeared, giving way to the cold steel of twilight. Lucas's mind had been racing nonstop since the moment he had crossed paths with Ben. The day had been a blur of unanswered questions, moments of despair, and glimpses of hope. As the hours stretched on, he couldn't help but think back to who he had been before this day, before the crying child on the park bench had altered the course of his life. He had been a man consumed by work, by deals, by ambition. But now, standing at the edge of something far more profound than anything he had ever faced, Lucas felt as though he had been given a second chance. chance to fight for something more important than wealth, status, or success. The footage from the street cameras had finally given Lucas a lead, a small but crucial clue that the man in the store was not just a stranger passing through. He had been waiting for something, watching for someone. As the footage continued to play, Lucas had zoomed in on the man's face, the cold eyes that had tracked the store's entrance. There was a calculated, almost predatory air to his movements. This was not a chance encounter. This man had been involved in something deliberate, something connected to Ben's mother. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling into something bigger than he could have imagined. There was a sense of danger now, not just for Ben, but for himself as well. The more Lucas thought about it, the more he realized how little he knew about the world he had stumbled into. The business world he had mastered had its own rules, its own rhythms. But this was something else entirely. It was messy, unpredictable, and deeply human. "We've got a hit on the man," the store clerk said as she returned to Lucas's side, her voice shaking slightly as she held up her phone. The street cameras caught him heading down a side alley, but after that, he disappeared. It's like he vanished off the map. "You don't get to walk away," Lucas shouted, his voice rising in frustration. "Where is she? Where is Ben's mother?" The man stopped, just for a moment, his shoulders stiffening. He didn't turn around, but his voice reached Lucas's ears in a hushed tone. "You don't want to know," he said, his voice tinged with something dark, something ominous. "You think you're helping, but you're just digging your own grave." With that, he vanished into the night, disappearing into the labyrinth of city streets, leaving Lucas with nothing but questions and the overwhelming sense that he was now caught in the middle of something far bigger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Lucas stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, as he watched the shadows swallow the man whole. He knew, with chilling certainty, that this was just the beginning. What lay ahead was a world of secrets, betrayal, and danger, far beyond anything Lucas had ever encountered. But in that moment, one thing was clear to him. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. He had made a promise to Ben, and he would keep it, no matter the cost. The fight was far from over, and Lucas Brady was about to dive deeper into a world that would change him forever. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. The fact that the man had disappeared so easily after leaving the store only added to the mystery. It confirmed what Lucas had feared. This wasn't just about a lost child. It was part of something far darker. "I don't know what's going on here," Lucas muttered under his breath. He looked back at Ben, who was sitting quietly on the bench, his stuffed dog still clutched tightly in his small arms. "But I'm going to get you the answers. I'm going to get you back to your mom." Ben's eyes flickered up at Lucas, a glimmer of hope shining through the fear and confusion that still lingered in his gaze. The boy had come to trust Lucas, had clung to the promise that everything would be okay, even when the world around them had turned chaotic. But the deeper Lucas got into this, the more he realized that everything wasn't going to be okay without a fight that could take them down roads they weren't prepared to walk. As Lucas paced in front of Ben, trying to make sense of the situation, his mind kept coming back to the one glaring truth. The woman who had abandoned Ben wasn't just a mother in distress. She was part of something bigger, something dangerous. The way she had left the store in such a rush, the man who had been lurking in the background, it all pointed to something far darker than a simple case of neglect. "I have to find her," Lucas muttered to himself. "I have to understand why she left him." Ben had been quiet for a while, but now he looked up at Lucas again, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you going to find her?" "My mom." Lucas knelt down in front of him, meeting his eyes with a solemn expression. "I will, Ben. I'm not stopping until I do." But even as he said the words, Lucas wasn't sure how much truth there was in them. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that Ben's mother had been running from something, and that something was far more complicated than a simple misunderstanding. Lucas couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of fear. Was he stepping into a world he wasn't ready to face? Was he putting himself and Ben in danger by pursuing this any further? "You don't have to be afraid," Lucas continued, trying to steady his voice. "We're going to figure this out. Just trust me." Ben nodded slowly, though there was still uncertainty in his eyes. The boy wasn't ready to let go of his hope just yet, but the reality was starting to set in. His world had shifted from one of safety to one of confusion and fear, and Lucas knew that it was his responsibility to shield him from that as best he could. "I'll stay with you," Lucas said, standing up. "I'm not leaving until we have answers." But just as he spoke, the sound of approaching footsteps made Lucas pause. He looked up, his heart rate quickening. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the light. A tall, broad-shouldered man, his features obscured by the hood of his jacket. He was walking straight toward them, his movements slow, deliberate. Lucas instinctively stepped closer to Ben, his hand instinctively reaching out to protect him. The man's eyes scanned the area, searching until they locked onto Lucas. And then, without a word, the man stopped. There was something about the way he looked at Lucas, something cold, almost calculating. For a moment, the two men just stood there, sizing each other up. Lucas's mind raced, adrenaline surging through him as he mentally assessed the situation. This man was no stranger. He had to be connected to Ben's mother, possibly even the man seen in the store earlier. "I'm looking for someone," Lucas said, trying to steady his voice. He wasn't sure if he was asking a question or making a statement, but there was no mistaking the intent behind his words. He wasn't going to let this man intimidate him. The man's lips curled into a thin, tight smile, though there was no warmth in it. "You're too late," he said simply, his voice low and gravelly. Before Lucas could react, the man turned, his back now to them as he began to walk away. It was as though he had expected Lucas to step aside, to let him go without a fight. But Lucas wasn't ready to let him slip through his fingers. This was the person who held the key to everything, the man who had been lurking in the background, watching, waiting.